Today, we reach the end of the section of Matthew's gospel that deals with parables. It's a little shorter than the last two gospels we heard in the last couple of weeks, and so I thought it might be good if we talked about all three of the parables and looked to see if we can find some meaning in each of them for us today. Now, I'm sure that most cultures, if not all, have histories where their people hid money and valuables by burying them in the ground, and especially during times of stress and of war. And this was also true in the time of Jesus, when there were no banks or institutions like that for keeping valuables safer than they'd be if you buried them in the ground, hidden from plain sight. Certainly, when I was growing up, a lot of literature that kids could read had to do with finding buried treasure, or maybe someone's savings from a long time before. And it stands to reason that folks would want to protect their hard-earned valuables from those who could cheat and steal from them. But there were also occasions where people would forget where they buried their stuff. Sometimes they might die before they could get to it, or maybe war or disaster would affect an area whose inhabitants were forced to leave, taking the secret of the buried treasure with them. And it would only be much later when somebody completely unconnected with it would find that treasure by accident. And so Jesus tells us the parable of the treasure hidden in the field. Somebody stumbles on it, finds it by chance, and realizes what it is. And then that person, completely happy to have found that treasure, hides that treasure again, only to go and sell all that he has in order to buy that field where it's contained. Now, really, it always seemed to me that most folks would be very tempted to dig up that treasure and simply take it. But not in this case. The treasure is left behind, and the entire field in which it's located is purchased. It just seems kind of odd that that's the case. Well, Jesus is telling us that the kingdom of God is that treasure. And he's also saying that it isn't possible to steal the kingdom of God. We have to be prepared to give up everything in order to get it. It can't be taken unjustly or secretly or even by force. And the finder has to sell everything to buy the field where that treasure has been hidden in order to get the treasure. And in telling that parable, Jesus is saying that heaven is a hidden reality. And it isn't just sitting out in plain sight, waiting to be picked up by anyone walking along. We have to be prepared to give up all else in order to get it. And because of the cost, we should consider it very, very valuable. And if we do obtain it, it's going to make us very rich, at least spiritually speaking, and provide us with the reward of everlasting life. And so that's the parable of the hidden treasure. Now, the second parable is kind of similar. Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant who's looking for fine pearls and ultimately finds one very, very fine pearl, and it has such a high value that the merchant goes out and he sells all he has, everything, and buys that one pearl. Now, in those days, pearls were considered the most valuable objects you could own, and this pearl was the very best of the best. Well, in the first parable, the finder at least has a field where he can set up a makeshift tent and maybe plant some vegetables. But this guy sells everything for a pearl. Now the pearl is all that he's got. It doesn't seem like there's much he could do with it. I mean, he's still got to live and eat and sleep and stay out of the rain and all that. Yet he's given up everything for that pearl. It does not sound like a good deal, and the purchase makes the merchant sound, well, compulsive and frankly, very foolish. But Jesus is telling his disciples that the pearl of great price is like the kingdom of heaven too, and that like the merchant who gives up everything for that pearl, the disciples too should be foolish in the same way as the merchant when it comes to the kingdom of God. What he's asking them to do is live a life of radical love. For them, nothing else should matter except that one thing, the pearl of great price, the kingdom of heaven. And they should be focused on that and try to forget everything else. And then finally, Jesus tells the last parable, the parable of the dragnet. Now, maybe you don't know what a dragnet is, but it's basically a net that's dragged behind a boat or two and collects everything, good and bad, that flows or swims into it while it's being towed. And eventually it's pulled up along with everything that it has caught. This was how some fishing was done in Jesus' day, and it's still used today. When that net is pulled up, there'll be things in it that you'll want to keep, and there'll be things in it that you do not want to keep. The good stuff will be saved, and the bad stuff will be thrown away. And Jesus says that this form of fishing is like what will happen to us at the end of the day, at the end of the age, at the end of time. When that happens, angels who will be like the fishermen of the parable will come and separate the good from the bad. Now, he's talking about those who will be brought into the kingdom of God and those who will not. Well, today's gospel reading, short as it is, gives us a reason to wonder what it might be that we can't give up to make it easier to follow Jesus. And Jesus is quite clear that we can have divided hearts. And the fact that we need to place him at the top of the list and to be prepared to give up other things to follow his promise. And he's telling us that if we don't, well, we run the risk of being thrown out, as the third parable seems to indicate. According to Jesus, heaven and hell are realities that we seriously need to consider in this life while we're able to. So a question remains. Are we supposed to sell everything we have in order to seek the kingdom of God? Well, certainly some folks are called to give up everything. Sister Phyllis, wake up. She's done that, and along with all the members of her community. To a lesser degree, I've done that. The monks at Mount Angel Abbey have done that. There are those who God inspires to actively choose to live lives of poverty. And Jesus today seems to be counseling his disciples to think about it for themselves. But what about the normal, regular lay people, especially those with families and others that need to be supported? Well, here's the thing. We're all invited to give things up, all of us. Some are invited to give up more than others, but no one is invited to give up nothing. Most have to support themselves and their families and others. In fact, those folks have an obligation to do just that. So while you might not be called to sell all that you have, you can still live the spirit of God's kingdom by frequently and generously giving up some of what you own to the poor. Two other things that can be done are regular fasting and maintaining a regular prayer life. These are all things that we practice during Lent, but it's not as though they can't be practiced during the course of the year. We are, after all, talking about a treasure to end all treasures. And the point is that Jesus is calling us, all of us, regardless of whatever else we've been called to first seek the kingdom of God in our lives. Everything else will be given to us once we've accepted that and put God first.